Power in Star Wars does not arrive with marching boots or sudden violence, but with paperwork speeches and applause. And that distinction is the saga's most unsettling political truth. The Republic does not lose its freedom through invasion, but through agreement. Authority is transferred willingly step by step, because each step feels rational in isolation. Democracy does not resist its own erosion, because it is told that erosion is necessary for survival. By the time disappearance is acknowledged, it has already been celebrated. This is why the fall of the Republic feels so quiet despite its scale, because nothing is ever framed as loss in the moment it occurs. Power is handed over in exchange for reassurance. Fear becomes a bargaining chip that justifies every concession. Each crisis reframes caution as weakness and decisiveness as virtue. The population is conditioned to applaud control because they are exhausted by uncertainty. Freedom fades not through force but through relief. Galactic Republic demonstrates how consent can be engineered when fear is sustained rather than resolved. Crises never fully end, they simply evolve to justify continued emergency authority. The system trains itself to rely on centralized power because decentralization feels slow and risky. Responsibility becomes something leaders are relieved to surrender. Governance transforms into management of anxiety. The Republic survives structurally while abandoning its purpose. Fear is the ultimate political weapon in this framework because it does not need to be invented, only amplified. Threats are prolonged rather than solved. Uncertainty is allowed to linger because it keeps people compliant. Safety becomes a promise that always requires more authority to fulfill. Citizens are taught to fear instability more than injustice. In that exchange, fear becomes self-sustaining. Emergency powers illustrate this logic perfectly because they are never framed as ambition, only as necessity. What begins as temporary oversight hardens into permanent structure because removing it feels irresponsible. No one wants to be blamed for the next crisis. Authority, once centralized, becomes difficult to redistribute. The system adapts around the exception until exception becomes norm. Democracy learns to live without itself. The Clone Wars accelerate this transformation by blurring moral boundaries until compromise feels unavoidable. Surveillance is justified as protection. Secrecy is justified as strategy. Obedience is justified as unity. Each measure is defended as temporary. Yet all of them reshape expectations permanently. War teaches people how to live under restriction without questioning it. Control becomes familiar, and familiarity breeds acceptance. Grand Army of the Republic embodies this normalization because its existence reframes politics as logistics. Decisions are measured by efficiency rather than legitimacy. Command structures replace deliberation. The presence of AR, massive army shifts civilian governance toward militarized thinking. Once problems are solved by forced debate, feels indulgent. The Republic does not notice when it stops governing and starts commanding. Within this environment, Palpatine's strategy thrives because it never challenges legality. It perfects it. He understands that law is most dangerous when it is trusted implicitly. Every move he makes is wrapped in procedure, consent and optics. Votes are secured, not coerced. Extensions of power are requested, not seized. The appearance of democracy is preserved while its substance is hollowed out. Resistance sounds unreasonable because everything appears legitimate. Palpatine wins by allowing others to believe they are choosing freely. He never needs to silence opposition early because fear does the work for him. People argue for his authority because they believe it will end uncertainty. He positions himself as solution rather than ruler. By the time anyone recognizes the pattern has already become system. Power does not need to announce itself when it is invited. This legalistic conquest reframes violence as unnecessary until the very end. Lightsabers are irrelevant compared to committees and chambers. The Jedi prepare for confrontation, while Palpatine prepares consensus. One side trains for battle, the other trains for inevitability. When conflict finally erupts, it is symbolic rather than decisive. The outcome has already been determined by structure. What emerges is a portrait of authoritarianism, built not on cruelty alone, but on exhaustion. People accept tyranny because chaos has worn them down. Control feels merciful when choice feels overwhelming. Stability is prized over accountability. The Republic hands over authority, not because it loves oppression, but because it fears uncertainty more. This is the quiet bargain at the heart of its fall. Power arrives through language, votes, and process, long before it arrives through force. Institutions remain standing, even as their function disappears. Citizens participate in their own disempowerment because participation feels safer than resistance. And by the time anyone asks who is in control, the answer feels obvious and unavoidable. Resistance in Star Wars does not emerge because institutions are attacked, but because they have already failed and left individuals with no structure to trust. By the time rebellion begins, the Senate is hollow, and the Jedi are gone. Systems that once mediated conflict have collapsed quietly through compromise. People do not rise up immediately because there is nothing obvious to rise against. Authority still looks legitimate even when it no longer protects anyone. This is why complicity spread so easily in the early empire, because neutrality feels like survival rather than cowardice. Most citizens are not loyalists, they are exhausted. They adapt to new language, new rules, and new expectations because adaptation feels safer than resistance. Each day without catastrophe reinforces the belief that compliance is working. Oppression survives not because it is loved, but because it is tolerated. Silence becomes the dominant political position. Galactic Empire thrives in this space between fear and fatigue. It does not demand constant enthusiasm, only absence of opposition. Its cruelty is selective enough to avoid universal outrage. Control is exerted unevenly, which isolates suffering and prevents solidarity. When injustice is experienced privately, it feels personal rather than political. The system depends on fragmentation to endure. This fragmentation explains why resistance must be decentralized to survive at all. The Rebel Alliance does not mirror the Republic's hierarchy because hierarchy has already proven fragile. Power concentrated at the top invites capture. The rebellion grows through cells, relationships, and local trust rather than centralized authority. Coordination exists, but control does not. Survival depends on adaptability rather than permanence. Rebel Alliance succeeds precisely because it refuses the structure that failed before. It values redundancy over efficiency and trust over procedure. Leadership is earned situationally rather than assumed institutionally. The movement remains unstable by design because stability is what allowed authoritarianism to crystallize. Resistance learns from collapse rather than ignoring it. This decentralized approach also reframes heroism away from singular saviors and toward collective action. Victories are partial, fragile, and costly. There is no illusion that one triumph will restore democracy fully. The rebellion understands that power must be constrained continuously, not seized once. Freedom is treated as process rather than prize. This mindset is born from watching institutions rot from complacency. Language itself becomes a battleground in this era because power reshapes meaning before it reshapes reality. Words like peace, order, and security are redefined until they justify their opposites. Stability means obedience. Order means silence. Security means surveillance. The Empire does not invent these words, it empties them. Once language is captured, dissent becomes difficult to articulate. Control begins at the level of definition. This linguistic manipulation reinforces why resistance sounds irresponsible to those still inside the system. Rebels are framed as threats to peace rather than responses to injustice. Violence committed by authority is normalized, while violence against authority is criminalized absolutely. The moral frame is inverted without ever announcing the inversion. People repeat language until belief follows repetition. Reality bends to vocabulary. What makes this warning resonate across the saga is that it does not end with the fall of one regime. Each era demonstrates how easily freedom erodes once fear replaces accountability. The Republic collapses through consent. The Empire collapses through overreach. Later systems struggle because memory fades faster than lessons. Cycles repeat because vigilance relaxes. History does not reset, it rhymes. Star Wars insists that institutions fail before people rebel because rebellion requires clarity that institutions are designed to delay. Systems absorb pressure until collapse feels unavoidable. By the time rebellion is justified, it is also devastating. Violence becomes the last remaining language because dialogue was abandoned earlier. The cost of delay is always higher than the cost of prevention. This is the saga's most bitter truth. This is why neutrality is never portrayed as harmless, even when it is understandable. Choosing comfort over confrontation does not stop harm, it redistributes it. The saga does not condemn ordinary people for surviving, but it refuses to romanticize inaction. Every authoritarian system depends on the belief that someone else will intervene. When that belief spreads, intervention becomes impossible. Responsibility diffuses until it vanishes. Legacy preserves this warning by repeating it in new contexts, rather than resolving it permanently. Each generation inherits structures shaped by previous fear. Language carries scars. Institutions remember shortcuts. The fight is never fully over because erosion resumes the moment attention drifts. Star Wars presents freedom as fragile not because it is weak, but because it requires effort. Maintenance is the price of liberty. The enduring power of this theme is that it refuses spectacle as explanation. Boots arrive last, not first. Violence follows consent rather than creating it. Power consolidates quietly before it declares itself loudly. By the time banners unfurl, resistance is already late. The saga asks audiences to watch the handover rather than the coronation. The warning lives in the process, not the climax. In this light, the entire story functions less as mythic fantasy and more as cyclical caution. Fear does not need villains to win only permission. Institutions do not collapse from attack, but from abdication. Language shapes morality before morality shapes action. Resistance survives by remembering what failed and refusing to repeat it. These patterns echo across every era because they are not about galaxies but about governance. The final resonance is clear and uncomfortable, that freedom is rarely taken by force alone. It is given away piece by people who believe they are choosing safety. Star Wars does not ask whether tyranny can rise again, it shows how easily it always does. The lesson is not that heroes must fight harder, but that citizens must notice sooner. And that warning endures precisely because it is never resolved.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.